When was the New Testament actually written? You probably have a general timeline in your head, right? The one you got from Sunday school. It usually goes something like this. A guy named Jesus does his thing around 30 CE. A few years later, his buddies Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John start writing it all down while it's still fresh. Then a guy named Paul writes some letters to his fan clubs in the 50s. It all seems pretty neat, tidy, and most importantly, close to the events. But what if I told you that timeline is a complete fantasy? A house of cards built on centuries of tradition, not a single piece of hard evidence. Therefore, today we're going to demolish that house. We're going to look at what the evidence have to say. And I promise you, the real story of how and when these books were cobbled together is way messier and, frankly, way more interesting than the fairy tale. Look, this isn't just some boring academic nitpick. As one of the scholars we'll be referencing today, Dr. Richard Carrier, points out, the dating of these texts is critical because it directly affects what it means or how viable it is. And he's absolutely right. The entire claim of Christianity, the whole foundation, rests on the idea that these are reliable historical documents written by eyewitnesses or people who knew eyewitnesses. So, when were the Gospels actually written? It seems like a simple question, but it's the whole ballgame. Because if these books were written decades or even a century after the supposed events by anonymous authors, then we're not talking about history. We're talking about mythology. So where do we even begin to untangle this mess? Well, we start with the biggest, most fundamental problem, which is that we can't just look up the dates on the original documents. Why? Because they aren't there. Right off the bat, we hit a massive wall. The texts themselves don't tell us when they were written. Scholars call this a vexatious problem because, to put it simply, we don't really know the answers. We're forced to work with huge, annoyingly big ranges of possible dates, sometimes spanning multiple decades. Now, this is especially weird for the letters. In the ancient world, it was completely typical to date your letters. You'd say who it was to, who it was from, and when you sent it. We have lots of examples of this from outside Christianity. But, as Dr. Carrier points out in the material we're looking at, for some reason, those dates have been stripped from the epistles of Paul. Let that sink in. The dates were removed. That's not an accident. That's like getting a letter in the mail with the postmark deliberately cut out. You don't do that if you're trying to preserve a historical record. You do that when you want to make a document seem timeless and universal for future arguments, not lock it into a specific time and place. And it gets worse. It's not just the dates that are missing, it's the authors. The Gospels are all technically anonymous. The titles you see in your Bibles, the Gospel according to Mark, the Gospel according to Matthew, weren't part of the original texts. Those names were slapped on much, much later, probably in the 2nd century, to give these anonymous documents an air of authority they didn't earn. Therefore, from the very beginning, we have to throw out the idea that we're dealing with clearly labeled historical documents. We're dealing with anonymous, undated texts where crucial information like the dates on the letters has been intentionally removed. This isn't a solid foundation for history, it's a foggy marshland of propaganda. So if there are no dates and no authors, how in the world does anyone even try to build a timeline? It seems impossible, right? Well, since historians had nothing to work with on the documents themselves, therefore they had to create their own starting point. They had to find what they believed were the oldest documents in the pile and then try to build everything else around them. It's like trying to solve a jigsaw puzzle with no corner pieces. You just have to grab an edge piece that looks important and start from there. And what did the mainstream scholarly consensus land on? The letters attributed to a literary figure named Paul. This is the official starting point, the supposed anchor that's meant to hold the entire New Testament timeline in place. Now, to be clear, we're not talking about all the letters with Paul's name on them. Many of them are widely recognized, even by conservative scholars, as forgeries, written long after the 50s. We're talking about the 7 that most scholars agree are probably from the same original source, the so-called authentic 7. 1 Thessalonians, Galatians, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Romans, Philippians, and Philemon. The consensus view, the one you'll find in pretty much any textbook, is that these were all written sometime in the 50s CE. They can't agree on the exact order or the specific year, but they've all kind of shaken hands and agreed to just lump them into that one decade. So this is it, our one solid point in a sea of uncertainty. The foundation upon which the entire New Testament timeline of the Gospels, Acts, and everything else is built. It sounds solid, right? A nice firm anchor. But what if that anchor is made of sand? What if the one thing everyone agrees to start with is itself a complete mess? Because that's exactly what it is, for three huge reasons. First, these aren't even single coherent letters. As both scholars in our source text agree, they're composite texts. Think of it this way. It's not like you're reading a single email someone wrote. It's like a later editor went into someone's outbox, took a paragraph from an angry letter, 3 sentences from a thank you note, and the sign-off from a travel update, and then stitched them all together and called it one letter to the Corinthians. They're Frankenstein monsters of documents. Second, the date itself is ridiculously fragile. The consensus puts these writings in the 50s CE, but, as Dr. Carrier points out, there's a whole debate among some scholars about whether the date should actually be the 50s BCE. Let that sink in. The supposed anchor for the entire timeline has a 100-year wobble in it. That's not an anchor, it's a wrecking ball. The fact that a legitimate scholarly debate can exist over a 100-year span for your foundational documents tells you just how uncertain all of this really is. And third, and this is the most important part for a mythicist like me, this Paul character never, ever talks about a historical Jesus. Read the letters. There's no mention of a guy from Galilee, no parables, no miracles, no Sermon on the Mount, no Judas, no trial before Pilate, nothing. His Jesus is a celestial being he learned about from scripture and through private revelations. That's exactly what you'd expect from a myth maker, not a history keeper. Therefore, our anchor is completely broken. The texts are sloppy patch jobs, the date is wildly uncertain, and the author shows zero knowledge of an actual historical person. This is not a foundation for history. But you know what? Let's be generous. Let's pretend for a minute that the anchor holds. Let's accept the 50 CE date just for the sake of argument and see what happens next. If the Pauline cult got its start in the 50s, where do the actual stories about a man named Jesus fit in? Well, the first thing we can say for certain is that they come much later. Therefore, the first narrative gospel, the first actual story of a human like Jesus, is the one we call Mark. And how do we know roughly when this anonymous book was written? Because it's clearly a story that is, as Dr. Carrier puts it, reacting very viscerally to a massive, traumatic historical event, the First Jewish-Roman War. The climax of that war was the total destruction of the Jewish temple in Jerusalem in the year 70 CE. The author of Mark writes about this catastrophe. Therefore, he had to be writing after it happened. The scholarly consensus is rock solid on this. The Gospel of Mark is a mythological reaction to the trauma of that war, written sometime in the 70s. And this is where the chain reaction starts. Because once Mark wrote his story, other anonymous authors came along and used it as their primary source material. Think of it like this. Mark is the original movie in a cinematic universe. Therefore, the next two authors, Matthew and Luke, are like directors of the sequels. They take the original script from Mark, keep most of the main plot points, but then add their own origin stories, special effects, and post-credit scenes to create their own versions. They're not independent accounts. They're literary remixes. So the timeline is clear. Mark is written in the 70s. Therefore, Matthew, who copies huge sections from Mark, has to be later. Scholars place him in the 80s. And Luke, who also copies from Mark, has to be even later, pushing well into the 90s. So even by granting them their wobbly anchor, the first story about Jesus isn't written until at least 40 years after he supposedly died. and the others are written 50 to 60 years later by people who were just editing the first guy's work. We are already way outside the realm of eyewitness testimony. But what if I told you it gets even later than that? Because there's an evidentiary smoking gun that proves one of those gospels was written long after the 90s, and it blows the traditional timeline to pieces. We are already way outside the realm of eyewitness testimony. But what if I told you it gets even later than that? Because there's an evidentiary smoking gun that proves one of those gospels was written long after the 90s, and it blows the traditional timeline to pieces. I'm talking about the Gospel of Luke and its sequel, Acts of the Apostles. Now, traditionally, people try to date these to the 80s or maybe 90 CE, but we know for a fact they have to be later than that. How? Simple. The author of Luke Acts cheated on his homework. He plagiarized. He copied from a well-known historian of the time, a man named Flavius Josephus. Josephus wrote a massive, famous history of the Jewish people called the Antiquities of the Jews. And here's the crucial fact. He published that book in the year 93 CE. The author of Luke Acts clearly read Josephus's work and lifted material directly from it to write his own story. You can literally put the texts next to each other and see it. It's the ancient equivalent of copy-pasting from Wikipedia and hoping your professor doesn't notice. The literary dependence is undeniable. Therefore, and this is the absolute killer for the traditional timeline, if the author of Luke Acts is copying from a book that wasn't published until 93 CE, then Luke Acts cannot possibly have been written before 93 CE. It's a literary and historical impossibility. In fact, as Dr. Carrier puts it, the trend in mainstream scholarship today is to push the date even later, closer to 115 or even 125 CE. We're talking about a full century after the supposed events this book claims to be about. This isn't a guess. This isn't a fringe theory. This is a hard external data point, a literary smoking gun. The author of the supposed history is writing creative fiction based on other people's work 100 years after the fact. And if Luke Acts is a 2nd century text, what does that do to the rest of the New Testament? Well, that's when the whole timeline collapses into the 2nd century. Therefore, any book that relies on, copies from, or argues with Luke Acts must be even later. This drags a huge chunk of the New Testament out of the 1st century entirely and drops it squarely into the 2nd. Let's start with the Gospel of John, the weird, mystical, philosophical one. As Dr. Carrier and other scholars have demonstrated, the author of John clearly knows the stories in Luke Acts and is writing in response to them. Therefore, John has to be later. The evidence puts its final composition somewhere between 120 and 140 CE. That's over 100 years after the supposed events. It's not a biography. It's a late-stage theological essay arguing with the Gospels that came before it. Then you get the so-called pastoral epistles, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. These are letters supposedly written by Paul to his junior pastors, but virtually all critical scholars agree they're forgeries. As Carrier notes, they are clearly 2nd century texts, written in a style very similar to the 2nd century Luke Acts. They were written by an anonymous author a century after Paul's time who was using a famous name to give his own opinions more weight. And finally, the granddaddy of all forgeries, 2nd Peter. Almost no scholar on the planet, liberal or conservative, thinks the Apostle Peter wrote this book. It's a very late 2nd century text, probably written around 150 CE. And why was it written? The author literally tells you he's desperately trying to insist on eyewitness testimony to argue against other Christians who are correctly pointing out that the stories were just cleverly devised myths. I mean, talk about an own goal. Do you see the pattern? These aren't historical records. They're late-stage forgeries. theological arguments, and counter-arguments. They were written to fight the religious and political battles of the 2nd century, a propaganda war between dozens of competing Christian sects, all trying to invent an origin story that put their faction in charge. So let's take a step back and look at the picture we've painted. It's not the one you learned in church, is it? We started with the simple traditional timeline that puts these books close to the life of an alleged historical Jesus. But at every single step, the actual evidence tore that timeline apart. We found that the documents are anonymous and undated, with crucial information, like dates, deliberately scrubbed from the letters. We found that the supposed anchor of the Pauline letters is a composite, wobbly mess whose author knows nothing of an earthly Jesus. We found that the first Gospels are not history, but late mythological reactions to a war written 40 to 60 years after the fact by authors copying from each other. And we found that a huge portion of the New Testament consists of outright forgeries from the 2nd century, written as propaganda in a war between competing Christian sects. Therefore, what are we left with? The dates aren't solid. The authors are anonymous. The stories are built on earlier myths, not eyewitness reports. This collection of books wasn't divinely inspired. It was assembled by a committee. One faction of Christians, around the year 150 CE, gathered these texts, edited them, and created an official canon as a propaganda tool to win a culture war and stamp out their competition. So let's take a step back and look at the picture we painted. It's not the one you learned in church, is it? We started with the simple traditional timeline that puts these books close to the life of an alleged historical Jesus. But at every single step, the actual evidence tore that timeline apart. We found that the documents are anonymous and undated, with crucial information, like dates, deliberately scrubbed from the letters. We found that the supposed anchor of the Pauline letters is a composite, wobbly mess whose author knows nothing of an earthly Jesus. We found that the first Gospels are not history, but late mythological reactions to a war written 40 to 60 years after the fact by authors copying from each other. And we found that a huge portion of the New Testament consists of outright forgeries from the 2nd century, written as propaganda in a war between competing Christian sects. Therefore, what are we left with? The dates aren't solid. The authors are anonymous. The stories are built on earlier myths, not eyewitness reports. This collection of books wasn't divinely inspired. It was assembled by a committee. One faction of Christians, around the year 150 CE, gathered these texts, edited them, and created an official canon as a propaganda tool to win a culture war and stamp out their competition. The New Testament isn't a reliable history of the 1st century. It's a manufactured, heavily edited anthology of mythology and propaganda from the 2nd century, designed to create an origin story for a savior who never existed. The takeaway here is simple. Always question the official story. Ask for the evidence. Don't just accept what you're told, whether it's from a pulpit or a professor. If you appreciate this kind of evidence-based breakdown and you want to keep digging into what the facts really say about these ancient myths, do all the YouTube things. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and definitely ring that notification bell so you don't miss the next one. Thanks for thinking with me today. Stay rational.